Now, sometimes we can see features that form in our sedimentary rocks after the sediment has been deposited. And this is what we call a sedimentary structure. So sedimentary structures form, like I said, shortly after those rocks have been deposited, but before they turn into an actual hard rock. Now, sometimes we can see things that are pretty intuitive. For example, down here we see mud cracks. So mud cracks form, right, when sediment has been inundated by water and then it dries out pretty quickly. Those mud cracks can be preserved in the rock record, as you see over here. So it tells us a little bit of information about the environment, right? Pretty environment specific. Sometimes we can see other things like footprints, right, from animals or dinosaurs, worm trails, right, or other burrows from other organisms. So there's a lot of sedimentary structures that we can see. Let's take a look at a couple very specific ones that we're going to see for the semester, such as cross-bedding. So if you were to look at this picture, right, you might notice that I've got rock at the top that is deposited in these pretty nice flat layers, and then down here, notice it's deposited on an incline. Okay. That's because these rocks are cross-bedded. So let's talk about what cross-bedded is. So let's say I'm in a river system and my water is moving this direction. If we were to look through the water column, I would notice that at the bottom of my river is where I have bigger pieces. In the water column itself is where I have those tiny little pieces. These big pieces at the bottom are rolling around and bumping along, and they tend to get stacked up on each other. Right? So as they get stacked up on each other, they're kind of forming these little hills, right? Like this. It's got a long slopey side and a short side over here. Well, what's going to happen is after it forms these little hills, they can't really get any taller, right? Because the water's moving all these pieces. So the next big grain that comes along is going to kind of move up this way. It's going to reach the top of this peak, and then it's going to fall downwards. The next grain is going to do the same thing, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So you see how I'm going to start to create these lines of sediment. So what it looks like, okay, if I were to take a look inside this bump, is I would see that this bump is made up of these lines of sediment, right? Those lines of these grains, right? All stacked up. That's physically what we're seeing here. So these lines here, right, are actually made up of these grains that are stacking up on the slopey side of this bump. Now what's important about this is it's telling us which direction that river was moving. Okay, so in order to create this stack, that means the river has to be moving in this direction. So in order to create cross beds here, that means my water was moving in this direction. So cross beds are actually pretty important because they tell us all about the direction of water movement. Now, I actually want to jump down to this one. We can talk about that bump that we just talked about, right? This bump here. Those are actually called ripple marks. So inside the ripple marks, we might see cross-bedding, but the structure itself is called a ripple mark. Now, ripple marks come in two different varieties. We can have symmetrical or asymmetrical. So symmetrical means my ripple mark is the same on both sides, right, as you can see here. When I see a symmetrical ripple mark, this is telling me my water is moving in two directions. It's moving this way and it's moving this way. So what's happening is I might have this bed, it's pushing the top over here and then over here, so it's keeping it in the center, right? Keeping it symmetric. So I might find this right up at the coastline, like along the beach. Asymmetrical, right, is what we see here, is what I just pointed out on the last drawing, right? So I have this long slopey side and then this short side. So when I see that, that's telling me that my water is moving in primarily one direction. Okay. We can also see these things called graded beds. Graded beds occur at the edges of our continents. So remember, I told you when we talk about our edges of the continents, we have our continental shelf, our slope, and then the abyssal plain. Well, sediment, as it's washing in from the continent, hits the edge of that continental shelf, and it's going to roll down the slope. And as it rolls down the slope, it's going to start to slow down and get deposited right here. And that deposit is what we call the graded bed. So at first, that current is moving very, very fast. Because it's moving very fast, it deposits large grains at the bottom. That current then starts to slow down. As it slows down, we deposit smaller and smaller particles as we move upwards. Right? So this is important because the graded beds actually tell us the location of the edges of our continents over time.